Hey guys, just a quick thank you to all of you amazing legends that are subscribed. I could not have done it without you. But most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and like this video. It's free and it really helps our small team out. It all started on a normal Tuesday, or at least it should have been a normal Tuesday. I didn't expect to be dealing with what happened later that night. The day had gone by pretty much like any other. Woke up, grabbed some breakfast, went to work, nothing out of the ordinary. But when I broke up with Madison, that's when everything changed. Let me give you some context first. Madison and I had been together for almost 2 years. We met in college, hit it off right away, and everything seemed perfect for a while. But over time, things got weird. Not in the usual way like arguments or drifting apart. Those are easy to handle. It was more like, well, it was like she was becoming someone else. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but she'd say or do these things that made me feel uneasy. Like I was slowly losing touch with who she really was. But I ignored it. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Anyway, the breakup. It came down to me just being tired. Tired of the weird behavior, tired of feeling like I was with a stranger half the time, tired of trying to make something work that didn't feel right anymore. So I sat her down in my apartment that evening, told her how I was feeling, and said it was over. She didn't take it well, but I didn't expect her to. Madison wasn't the type to cry or get angry in the way most people do when they're upset. She kind of just stared. It was unsettling. Like her eyes were looking at me, but not really seeing me. I kept trying to explain myself, but she was silent, just staring. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured she'd cry it out, maybe shout a little, but eventually she'd move on, and we'd both go our separate ways. I even thought about calling a cab for her, just to make sure she got home safe, but then she stood up and walked toward the door. She didn't even look back when she left. The rest of the night felt like I was waiting for a storm that never hit. I didn't sleep well, but that wasn't unusual. Breakups suck, right? I kept thinking about her, about the way she walked out, about the way her expression had been. It bothered me, but I shrugged it off. Maybe it was better if she just wanted to be alone. I thought I'd check in with her the next day, make sure she was doing okay, but I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. The next morning, I woke up to a text from her. I opened it with a sigh, half expecting it to be something passive-aggressive, maybe even a guilt trip. But it wasn't. It was just a single word. Mark. I stared at the screen for a long time. I thought I was just overthinking it. Maybe she was trying to be funny, or maybe it was just typo. I don't know. But I responded with a simple, what? A few hours later, after work, I came back home and was shocked to find her standing at my front door. I hadn't expected her to show up, and honestly, I wasn't sure what to do. But the look in her eyes, it was like she wasn't even the same person anymore. Her face was pale, and her hair, which had always been perfectly done, was a mess. She stood there, her arms crossed, and before I could say anything, she did the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. She made a noise. At first, I thought it was a joke, like she was trying to get under my skin. But then she did it again. It was a low, guttural sound that didn't make sense, like an animal. No, not like an animal, like a dog. It was almost like she was trying to bark. I laughed at first, thinking maybe she had lost her mind. But when she kept going, it wasn't funny anymore. It was creepy. I asked her what the hell she was doing, but she didn't answer me. She just kept standing there, her eyes fixed on me, and barking, louder this time, more intense. I backed away from the door, my heart starting to race. My thoughts were scrambling. What was happening? This wasn't her. It couldn't be. I wasn't sure what to do, so I stepped inside, thinking if I just closed the door, maybe she'd leave. But then the barking got louder, and it wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from the street. I went to the window, looked out, and saw her standing in the middle of the sidewalk, surrounded by people who were staring at her like she was some kind of freak. The way she was barking at them, pacing, waving her head like she was some kind of animal, people were backing away, and someone even crossed the street to avoid her. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Was this real? Was I losing my mind too? But the noise kept coming. Sharp, erratic barks, growls, even some whines. The people around her were looking at her like she wasn't human. And the worst part, she wasn't stopping. I stayed at the window, frozen, unsure if I should go out there or just call the cops. But then, out of nowhere, she stopped barking and looked straight at me, her eyes wild, almost glowing. The people around her were backing away, running, and she just stood there like she was waiting for something. Like she was waiting for me to make the next move. It wasn't like she was upset or angry. It was like she was changed. The whole scene freaked me out, but I couldn't stop watching her. Something was off. Madison wasn't Madison anymore. This thing, whatever it was just not her. I didn't know what else to do, so I grabbed my phone and called her mom. She was one of the few people I could think of who might know what was going on, but when I called, her mom didn't answer. She never answered. And when I looked out the window again, Madison was gone, like nothing had happened at all. I stood there, staring at the empty street, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. But I couldn't. I still don't know what happened that night. What I saw, what she was doing. I've thought about it every day since. I tried calling her again the next day, and the next, but she didn't pick up. I left messages, but I haven't heard from her. Sometimes when I walk down the street, I swear I can hear a bark echoing somewhere in the distance. And every time I hear it, I feel like I'm being watched. I'm not sure who or what I broke up with that night, but I know for sure it wasn't Madison. It was supposed to be just another breakup. You know, the kind where it's awkward for a bit. Maybe you cry, maybe you get mad, but in the end, it's over and you move on. But with Greg, nothing was ever simple. And that night, things took a weird turn I wasn't expecting. Not in a million years. I had been thinking about breaking up with him for weeks. Greg was a good guy, but he was also, well, a little off. He had these weird quirks that were cute at first, but as time went on, they became uncomfortable. He would get overly clingy, show up at my work uninvited, and even started tracking my social media posts like it was his full-time job. I tried talking to him about it a few times, but he always brushed it off like it wasn't a big deal. So I finally made up my mind. It had to end. The day I called it off was like any other. We were sitting in my apartment just hanging out, and I told him I couldn't do it anymore. He didn't take it well. I mean, I guess no one really does, but Greg. He completely lost it. At first, he went quiet. Not the sad kind of quiet, but the creepy kind. Like he was thinking about something way too deeply. Then, out of nowhere, he pulled out his phone. I figured he was going to call a friend or whatever, but no, he dialed 911. I thought I was hearing things, honestly. I mean, who calls the cops over a breakup? But he did. He was speaking to the operator in this calm, almost robotic voice. I couldn't hear the exact words, but I could tell he was trying to explain that I was hurting him and threatening him. I couldn't help but roll my eyes, but my stomach dropped. Something about the way he was acting made me feel uneasy. Like he wasn't just mad, but he was planning something. At first, I thought he was just messing with me. I mean, who actually calls the cops in a breakup situation? But then when the operator answered, things got weird. I could hear a woman's voice on the other end of the line. She didn't sound too concerned. She wasn't asking if Greg was hurt or if he needed help. She was laughing. It wasn't even a friendly chuckle. It was the kind of laugh that makes you feel like you're the punchline of a joke you don't understand. I could see Greg's face change as he listened. His expression went from frustration to confusion, and then to something else, something darker. I thought maybe he was just embarrassed, but then the operator stopped laughing. The next thing I heard was a click. She hung up on him. I'll never forget the look on his face. It was like everything inside him cracked in that moment. His eyes were wide, his lips pulled back in a tight grin, like he wasn't sure whether to cry or laugh himself. He stood up, pacing back and forth in front of me, muttering to himself under his breath. It was like he wasn't even seeing me anymore, like he was trapped in his own mind, trying to figure out what to do next. I sat there frozen, not knowing whether I should say something or just let him work through whatever was happening in his head. I didn't want to provoke him, but I was also terrified of what was going on. It wasn't just a breakup anymore. It was like something had shifted in him, something I couldn't understand. Then, after what felt like forever, he turned back to me, his eyes now wide and frantic. His voice was shaky as he told me that the cops are coming, and I wouldn't get away with this. I was confused. I thought maybe he was just rambling, but he was dead serious. I stood up and backed away. I didn't want to provoke him, but I also didn't want to be in the same room as him anymore. He was acting completely irrational, and I had no idea how to handle it. But before I could even get out of the room, he rushed to the door, throwing it open. I tried to grab my jacket and leave, but he was already standing there, blocking the way, his hands gripping the door frame like he was ready to stop me from walking out. Greg, just let me go, I said, my voice shaking out too. But he wasn't listening. Instead, he started to laugh, this strange, broken laugh that didn't sound like him at all. He was holding onto the door like it was his lifeline, and I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. His eyes darted around the room like he was trying to make sure I didn't escape. It was like he was trapped in this warped version of reality where nothing made sense. I tried to stay calm. "Greg, I'm leaving. Please just let me go." And then it happened. As if on cue, we both heard the sound of a siren wailing in the distance. It was getting closer. My heart sank. I had no idea what was going on in his head, but I knew I needed to get out of there. I pushed past him and ran out the door. The siren was almost deafening now. As I sprinted down the hallway, I could see the flashing lights of a police car pulling up in front of the building. I was so confused. What had he told them? What did he think was going to happen? I didn't wait around to find out. I ducked into an alley nearby, hoping to stay hidden. I could hear Greg calling after me from inside the building, his voice sounding both desperate and threatening. It was like he didn't even care about the cops anymore. He just wanted me to feel trapped, to feel like there was no way out. But I wasn't sticking around to find out what he had planned. The cops showed up, but I didn't stick around to explain anything. I couldn't. Greg was unpredictable, and I wasn't about to risk being anywhere near him when he was like this. I still don't know exactly what happened after I left. I've never gone back to that apartment. I heard from some friends that the cops didn't really do anything. They talked to Greg for a while, but apparently they didn't take him seriously. One of my friends told me they laughed at him when he tried to explain his side of the story, like they just saw it as some kind of joke. They didn't even bother to take a report. But for me, it wasn't a joke. It was the beginning of something that I'm still trying to understand. It wasn't just a breakup. It was something darker. Something I'm not sure I'll ever fully understand. I just know that when I left, I didn't just leave Greg. I left the Greg I thought I knew behind. And whatever was left, whatever was still in that apartment was something different. Something dangerous. I don't know where he is now or what he's doing, but I hope I never have to find out. It was one of those days where everything just felt off. I woke up that morning knowing I had to do something I'd been putting off for weeks. Break up with Tom. It wasn't like I hated him or anything. I still cared about him, I guess. But the relationship was just exhausting. It wasn't the good kind of exhausting. It was the kind where you're constantly second-guessing yourself, wondering if you're being stupid, but knowing deep down that something isn't right. It didn't help that I caught him being shady more times than I could count. My gut had been telling me something for months, but I didn't listen. But that day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The frustration had built up to a breaking point, and I knew it was over. So, after we spent most of the afternoon watching Netflix on the couch like we always did, I finally spoke up. I had rehearsed the breakup in my head 100 times, trying to make it sound casual, like it wasn't a big deal, but still firm enough that he couldn't pull the "let's work on it" card. I didn't want to give him that out. I didn't want to be one of those people who went back to a toxic relationship just because they were scared of being alone or hurt. But as soon as I said the words, it was like I triggered something in him. Instead of getting upset or trying to convince me to stay, he just kind of smirked, like he knew something I didn't. It threw me off for a second, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was trying to mask the hurt, or maybe he didn't care. I couldn't figure it out. I wanted to be the one in control here, so I just stood there, waiting for him to say something. And then he did. He told me he'd been seeing multiple women anyway. Like it was no big deal. He didn't need me. It was just a casual thing, and he was doing just fine without me. I don't know why, but hearing those words stung. I guess I expected more of a reaction from him, but instead, he just sounded bored, like it was some trivial thing he was confessing. It wasn't even a confession, really. It was like he was just casually informing me of something I should have already known. And then it hit me all at once. This wasn't just about me breaking up with him. This was about him being the one who never cared. He didn't care about me or us or anything I thought we had. That's when I really started to feel sick. The betrayal wasn't even the worst part. It was the way he said it. Like he was doing me a favor, like he was just informing me of a fact I had somehow missed. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He just stared at his phone, scrolling through texts or whatever, not even bothering to pretend he was upset. It wasn't even like he was trying to make it sound casual or cool. It was just there. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him how long this had been going on, who else he was seeing, how many others he had been with while we were still together. But something told me that it didn't matter. I could have asked all those questions, but it wouldn't have changed anything. He wasn't going to apologize. He wasn't going to feel guilty. And honestly, He probably didn't even care enough to explain himself. I stood there in silence for a few seconds, trying to process everything. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had no idea who this guy was anymore. Maybe I never really knew him at all. He'd always had this weird charm about him, this ability to make you feel like you were the most important person in the room. But now, it felt like a mask. The whole time we'd been together, I had been wearing the mask too. I don't know how long I stood there just staring at him, but eventually I turned around and started walking out of the room. I couldn't look at him anymore. I couldn't even stand to be in the same space. As I was about to leave the apartment, he called out to me. He didn't even sound upset. He just sounded bored again, like I was inconveniencing him by leaving. It wasn't even a goodbye. It was more like a half-hearted whatever. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me, and that's when the weirdest part of the whole situation hit me. It wasn't the betrayal, it wasn't the lies, and it wasn't even the fact that he'd admitted to seeing multiple women. It was how easy it had been for him to brush me off, how casually he let go of me. I had been wrapped up in this relationship for months, trying to figure out where it went wrong, trying to make things work, and he had been playing this game the whole time. It didn't matter to him. None of it mattered. I stood in the hallway for a few moments, breathing heavily. My mind was racing. I should have been furious, right? I should have been crying or yelling or feeling something other than this sick sense of realization. But instead, I just felt empty. I left the building and walked down the street, unsure of where I was going. It wasn't until I got halfway down the block that I realized I hadn't even said goodbye to him properly. But the more I thought about it, the less it seemed important. What was there to say? As I walked, I found myself thinking about the women he was seeing. Had I known any of them? Did they know about me? I couldn't help but feel this weird sense of connection with them, even though I had no idea who they were. It was like in some twisted way we were all tied together by him, and I hated that. I had this image in my head of him sitting in that apartment, probably with his phone out, texting one of them or maybe even making plans to meet up later. It made my stomach turn, but it also made me feel free. As messed up as it was, knowing that he was done with me felt like a relief, like I could finally breathe again. I don't know if he'll ever try to contact me again. I don't know if he'll care enough to apologize or explain himself. But honestly, I don't care. I'm done. What's weird is I still don't know if I was a fool for not seeing it sooner, or if he was the idiot for thinking I'd stick around. Either way, I'm out, and I'm not looking back. I stood in the hallway for a few moments, breathing heavily. My mind was racing. I should have been furious, right? I should have been crying or yelling or feeling something other than this sick sense of realization. But instead, I just felt empty. I left the building and walked down the street, unsure of where I was going. It wasn't until I got halfway down the block that I realized I hadn't even said goodbye to him properly. But the more I thought about it, the less it seemed important. What was there to say? As I walked, I found myself thinking about the women he was seeing. Had I known any of them? Did they know about me? I couldn't help but feel this weird sense of connection with them, even though I had no idea who they were. It was like in some twisted way we were all tied together by him, and I hated that. I had this image in my head of him sitting in that apartment, probably with his phone out, texting one of them or maybe even making plans to meet up later. It made my stomach turn, but it also made me feel free. As messed up as it was, knowing that he was done with me felt like a relief, like I could finally breathe again. I don't know if he'll ever try to contact me again. I don't know if he'll care enough to apologize or explain himself. But honestly, I don't care. I'm done. What's weird is I still don't know if I was a fool for not seeing it sooner, or if he was the idiot for thinking I'd stick around. Either way, I'm out, and I'm not looking back. I thought I was done with the drama. I thought I had it all figured out. But sometimes life throws you a curveball you're not ready for. And breaking up with Tina, well, it wasn't as simple as I thought it would be. I had no idea how crazy it was going to get. It started out normal enough. Tina and I had been together for about a year. At first, everything was great. She was fun, outgoing, easy to talk to, one of those people who could make you feel like you were the only person in the room. I was into her, and it seemed like she was into me too. But like most relationships, things started shifting over time. Little red flags popped up here and there, but I brushed them off. I thought, this is normal. Every relationship has its ups and downs. I convinced myself that it was just a phase. But it wasn't. I began to notice things. She'd get really defensive when I asked simple questions about where she'd been or who she was with. There were nights she'd stay out later than usual, and I'd get texts that didn't quite add up. I tried talking to her about it, but she'd always turn it around, making me feel like I was the one being paranoid or controlling. It didn't help that she was super active on social media, always posting pics with her friends or at bars. But whenever I'd ask about certain people or places, she'd get weirdly vague. It all came to a head one night when I stumbled upon some messages on her phone. She'd left it unlocked, probably not realizing I'd pick it up while she was in the shower. I saw everything. The messages with this guy, the plans to meet up, the pictures they'd exchanged. My stomach dropped. I didn't even need to confront her right away. It was all right there in front of me. She had been cheating. I don't even know how I felt in that moment. It wasn't rage or heartbreak. It was just this cold, numbing feeling of disbelief. It wasn't like I hadn't suspected something was off, but to actually see it laid out so clearly like I was some kind of idiot was a gut punch. I waited until she came out of the shower to say something. I tried to keep my voice steady calm, but I could feel the anger creeping up. I told her what I'd found. The look on her face was something I'll never forget. It wasn't guilt or shame, not at all. It was more like she didn't even care. She was surprised I found out, but not sorry. At first, she didn't really say much. She sat there on the edge of the bed, just staring at me, trying to think of what to say. I could see she was annoyed, like I was wasting her time with this stupid accusation. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't an apology. She didn't even seem to care about the fact that she betrayed me. Instead, she just shrugged and said, "Well, whatever. It's not like you're perfect either." I lost it then. I couldn't believe she was making this about me. I'd given everything in this relationship, tried so hard to make it work, and she just tossed it all aside. In that moment, I knew there was no coming back from this. I broke up with her. I told her it was over and walked out of the room, not even caring if she said anything else. I just needed to leave. I needed to get out of that place, away from her, and away from the mess she'd created. But as I packed a bag and grabbed my stuff, I started hearing her voice again. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging for forgiveness. She was yelling. But not at me. She was yelling at her phone. I don't know why, but I decided to stick around for a second. I stood by the door, listening to her rant, wondering if she was still in denial about what had just happened. Then it hit me. She was posting about me. She was typing something up on Instagram. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just her trying to get attention, venting like most people do. But as I stood there, I started piecing things together. She wasn't just posting about the breakup. She was posting about me. Her story blew up in the most messed up way. She posted some picture of us when we were still happy, like one of those cute couple pics you put on social media to make everyone else jealous. But the caption, it wasn't "I love you forever" or "can't believe we're breaking up." No, it was "this is what happens when you date someone who doesn't care about you." I gave him everything, and he just neglected me. He didn't appreciate anything I did for him. So here's to moving on, finding someone who knows how to treat me. I couldn't believe it. The audacity. She turned everything around and made me the bad guy. She made me sound like the villain in our story, as if I had been the one to screw things up. I could see her followers eating it up. Guys leaving comments about how she deserves better, how I didn't deserve her. I felt like I'd been sucker punched all over again. She knew how to play the game, and she knew just how to make me look bad to everyone we knew. It wasn't even about her cheating anymore. It was about me being a bad boyfriend in her eyes, and she was going to drag me through the mud to make sure everyone saw it that way. I tried not to react at first. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction. But as I sat there scrolling through her post, reading all the comments, I realized how many of our friends were jumping on her side. People I thought knew me better. People who had been around when we were good. People who had seen me try. They were suddenly all Team Tina. It stung. It stung bad. It got worse the next few days. She posted more about the truth of our relationship, throwing in vague comments about how I'd always been distant and how I was never there when she needed me. None of it made any sense. None of it was even true. But it didn't matter. People were sharing it, liking it, commenting on how brave she was for speaking out. I couldn't keep up with all the lies she was spreading. It was like the more she talked, the more I was painted as the asshole in our breakup. I'd been careful to avoid trashing her on social media, but that didn't stop her from doing it to me. I wanted to respond. I wanted to call her out and say all the things she'd done, but I knew it would just make things worse. It would only give her more fuel for the fire. So I kept quiet. I didn't engage, but it hurt. It really hurt to see everything we had twisted into something ugly. The whole situation felt like a nightmare. Not because I lost Tina, But because I lost the version of her I thought I knew, she wasn't the girl I had been in love with anymore. She was someone else. Someone who would rather ruin me publicly than take responsibility for her own actions. Eventually, I deleted all our photos from my social media. I didn't want to be reminded of what had happened, and I didn't want to see her nonsense anymore. It wasn't until later, when I finally stopped checking her posts, that I realized I was starting to feel better. Sure, it still stung sometimes, but I knew I wasn't the one who had messed up. And maybe, just maybe, I had dodged a bullet. It's funny how you think you know what a breakup will look like. You imagine the tears, the maybe awkward silence, the closure, and maybe even a hug. What you don't expect is for the person you're breaking up with to physically try to wrestle you into staying. But that's exactly what happened with Kara. We had been together for about a year. When we first started dating, it was amazing. Everything felt so easy, like we were on the same wavelength, and I couldn't get enough of her. She had this energy about her, always on the go, always making me laugh, and I couldn't help but feel drawn to her. But over time, things started shifting. It wasn't anything huge at first, just small stuff. She started becoming a little too clingy, constantly checking in on where I was or who I was with. At first, I thought it was cute. I mean, I liked her a lot, so I didn't mind it. But then it turned into something else. I couldn't hang out with my friends without getting questions. I couldn't go grab lunch without a bunch of texts asking what I was doing. Eventually, I realized I wasn't really enjoying the relationship anymore. It wasn't even that I didn't care about her. Kira was a good person at heart. It was more like we were growing in different directions. I wanted space. I wanted to get back to doing the things I liked, spending time with my friends, not feeling like I was being watched. I tried talking to her about it a couple of times, but it was always a dead end. She'd get defensive, say she was just worried about me, and make me feel bad for wanting time away from her. So, yeah, I knew it had to end. I couldn't keep going in a relationship where I felt suffocated. It wasn't fair to either of us. The problem was I wasn't sure how to break up with her. She was a sensitive person, and I knew it would hurt her. But I couldn't live in that space anymore. That evening, I knew it was the right time. Kyra had been over at my apartment, sitting on the couch with her phone, scrolling through Instagram. I was sitting across from her, just kind of zoning out, knowing what I was about to say. She probably could tell something was up, but I don't think she expected it to go the way it did. I was dreading the conversation, but at the same time, I knew it was necessary. I wanted to be upfront and honest with her, even if it wasn't going to be easy. When I finally told her I was done, it was like the whole room shifted. She looked up from her phone, her face instantly going pale. I could see the confusion in her eyes, followed by this wave of panic. She started asking if I was serious, if there was something she could do to change things, but I just knew that we were past that point. I explained that I cared about her, but I didn't think we were right for each other anymore. It wasn't about her. It was about me needing space, needing to focus on myself. The first few minutes after I said it were quiet. Too quiet. She didn't cry right away, but I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. And then, without warning, she lunged at me. I didn't even have time to react before she was in my face, her hands grabbing at my shoulders, trying to pull me back to the couch. It was as if she was in shock, trying to force me into staying, into taking it back. I was so caught off guard that I just froze. The weight of her body pressed into me, and for a second, I honestly didn't know what was happening. Her hands around my chest, pushing me back, and she was trying to pull me down. The look in her eyes wasn't anger, though. It was desperation. She wasn't physically strong enough to actually hurt me or anything, but I could feel how frantic she was. She was shaking, her breath coming out in low gasps, like she couldn't believe what I'd said. I tried to pull away, but she grabbed my arm, pulling me back, clinging to me like she was afraid I was going to disappear. I didn't want to hurt her, but I also didn't want her to think this was a game or that I was going to change my mind. I tried to push her off gently, but the harder I tried to back up, the more aggressive she became. It felt like I was dealing with a completely different person. She started crying, heavy sobs that made my stomach twist. But she wasn't letting go. She wrapped her arms around me like a vice, and I could feel her nails digging into my skin. It wasn't even a hug anymore. It felt like she was physically stopping me from leaving. I kept trying to pull away, but she wouldn't budge. I started to panic a little, realizing that she wasn't just sad or upset. She was acting like I was trying to abandon her, like I was some monster for wanting out. I remember just standing there awkwardly, trying to keep my balance while she was clinging to me. The whole situation felt insane. It was like I couldn't get away from her. I knew I had to stay calm, but it felt like everything I'd been worried about when it came to breaking up with her was happening right in front of me. I'd seen how emotional she could get, but I had never expected her to physically fight me like this. It felt like I was suffocating, not just from the situation, but from the way she was holding on so tightly. Eventually, I managed to stand up, but she'd followed me, grabbing at my jacket. She started begging me to stay to give her another chance, but it wasn't about that anymore. It wasn't about trying to fix things. I could see she was too wrapped up in the idea of us to really listen to what I was saying. I finally had to step back, telling her I wasn't going to change my mind. I pulled away from her grip and moved toward the door. She didn't say anything at first, but then she collapsed onto the couch, still sobbing uncontrollably. It was the kind of cry that made my chest tighten, but I knew I couldn't stay. I left the apartment without looking back. My heart felt like it was in a vice, but I knew I had to do it. I had to get out. The whole situation felt surreal, like it didn't even happen the way it had played out in my head. It was like I was in some twisted version of reality where everything was upside down. The girl I was in love with, the girl I thought I knew, was suddenly someone else. Someone desperate. Someone who was trying to wrestle me into staying when I couldn't do that anymore. I didn't hear from her for a few days after that. I felt bad, but I knew I couldn't go back. Sometimes I wonder if things could have turned out differently, but I'm not sure. What I do know is that I'll never forget that moment, standing there, watching her try to physically force me to stay. It was one of the most unsettling things I've ever experienced, and even now I'm not sure how to feel about it. But in the end, I did what I had to do. And it's something I'll always carry with me, even if it's not a chapter I want to revisit. I never thought a breakup would turn into a nightmare, but with Darnell, it definitely did. I don't even know where to start. It's one of those things that when I think back, I'm like, did that really happen? But it did, and I'll never forget it. Darnell and I had been together for a while, around a year and a half. At first, everything was great. We were super close, hung out all the time, and laughed about dumb stuff. It was one of those relationships where you think, hey, maybe this could last forever. But as time went on, things started feeling off. It wasn't anything huge at first, just little things. He'd get jealous over stupid stuff, blow up my phone when I didn't respond right away, and started showing up at my house uninvited. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I was overreacting. But it got worse. He tried to control where I went, who I hung out with. I could feel myself pulling away, but I wasn't sure how to tell him. Eventually, I had to face it. I wasn't happy anymore. I had no space to breathe, no time for myself. I knew something had to give, so I decided I had to break up with him. The worst part was, I had no idea how to even approach it. I was scared. He was unpredictable when it came to stuff like this. I didn't want a scene. But what happened? Yeah, it was a scene. A big one. I chose a Tuesday night to tell him. I figured he'd be less likely to make a big deal about it on a random Tuesday, but I was wrong. Darnell's not the kind of guy who just accepts things, especially not something like a breakup. When I told him I thought we should end things, he stared at me like I just told him the world was flat. He looked at me all confused, like he thought I was joking. This is a prank, right? He kept asking. He laughed a little, and I could see the disbelief in his face. Like, how dare I be serious about something like this? I told him it wasn't a joke, that I was done, and we needed to go our separate ways. But he didn't move. He didn't leave. He sat there on my couch, still looking at me like I was playing some messed up game. And when he didn't leave, I figured he'd just hang around for a while, get upset, maybe leave after a few awkward moments. I did not expect him to sit there for hours, completely refusing to accept that this was real. After about 2 hours, I started feeling suffocated. He wouldn't leave. He wouldn't stop talking, asking me what went wrong and why I was doing this. It got to the point where I had to walk to the other room just to get away from him. But even then, he stayed. It was like he couldn't process the idea of me breaking up with him, like it was so far out of his reality that he thought it must have been some kind of prank. I tried to make it clear that I needed him to go, but nothing worked. I said, Darnell, I'm serious, I need space. Please leave. But he just kept sitting there staring at me. And that's when things took a darker turn. The next day, I thought he'd finally gotten the message. I didn't hear from him, and I figured maybe he was giving me the space I asked for. But then around noon, I heard a knock at the door. I figured it was probably a neighbor or someone else, but when I opened it, there he was. Darnell, standing on my doorstep. He had this look in his eyes like he was totally out of touch with reality. I was so stunned to see him, I froze for a second. Let me in, he said. Not, can we talk? Or, I just want to explain. No, He said, "Let me in." I didn't even know what to say. I didn't invite him over. I didn't even know why he thought it was okay to show up unannounced after I told him it was over. But the worst part was when I stepped back to close the door, he tried to push past me and into my apartment. It wasn't a subtle move either. He literally shoved himself against the door and tried to open it with his body. My heart started pounding. I didn't know what to do. I could feel my hands shaking. I didn't let him in. I didn't back down. I closed the door in his face and locked it. I thought that would be the end of it, but no, it wasn't. For the next few hours, Darnell just camped out on the sidewalk in front of my apartment building. I could see him through the window, pacing back and forth. He'd stop, stare up at my window for a few minutes, and then start pacing again. It was like he was waiting for me to come out to change my mind. I didn't know if I should be scared, angry, or just confused by his behavior. It didn't stop there, though. He kept knocking on my door every hour or so, each time with more insistence. He wouldn't leave. He'd say he just wanted to talk, that we could work things out, that I was making a huge mistake. The same stuff I already heard a million times. Eventually, I realized I couldn't handle it anymore. I couldn't just wait for him to go away, hoping it would get better. I wasn't sure what he was thinking, but at that point, I was genuinely concerned. I didn't know if he was just embarrassed or if he was seriously losing his grip on reality. I called the police. It felt crazy, but I was scared. I didn't know what else to do. When the officer arrived, I explained the situation as calmly as I could, though my voice was shaking. I told them about the breakup, how he showed up uninvited, and how he had been lingering outside my apartment for hours. I didn't want to make a big deal of it, but I was genuinely scared that he wasn't going to leave until he got what he wanted. It took the cops a little while to get him to leave, but they eventually managed to get him away from my building. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. But even after they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why couldn't he just accept it? Why couldn't he move on? I didn't hear from him after that, and I didn't want to. I blocked him on everything, changed my number, and did everything I could to make sure he couldn't contact me again. But the whole situation still haunts me. I think about how someone can't take no for an answer, how they can't seem to process the end of something, and how they believe with everything they have that they're entitled to more than what's been given. I hope he eventually figured it out, but honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. I just wanted to get my life back to normal without him in it, and I never want to experience anything like that again. I never thought breaking up with someone could get this out of hand. It's supposed to be simple, right? You tell them how you feel, you end things, and then you move on. But with Goji, it was a mess from the start, and the way it ended, well, let's just say it was a whole different kind of drama. Looking back, I can barely believe it all happened. We'd been together for almost a year, and it wasn't terrible at first. In the beginning, she was sweet, funny, and I honestly thought we had something real. But then, the red flags started to show up. She was always controlling, jealous, and the smallest things would set her off. She called me constantly when I was out with friends, accusing me of not caring enough or of talking to other girls. Every time I tried to talk about it, she'd turn it around on me like I was the one doing something wrong. Eventually, I realized it wasn't just the occasional argument. It was constant drama, constant stress. I was walking on eggshells, never knowing what would set her off next. I tried to ignore it for as long as I could, thinking it was just a phase where I could fix things. But it got worse. I'd get random outbursts, fights that would escalate for no reason. She'd call me names, get in my face, make me feel like I was the one with all the issues. And honestly, I was done. I'd had enough. So one afternoon, I knew I had to end it. It wasn't going to get better, and I couldn't keep going in a relationship that was slowly destroying my peace of mind. I wasn't expecting a calm, collected breakup. I already knew Goja didn't take well to being told no, but I didn't expect her to react like she did. It all went down at my place. I had been dreading it all day. Goji had been texting me nonstop, acting like everything was fine, but I knew it was just her usual emotional manipulation. She wanted to hang out that afternoon, and had already planned on telling her I was done. When she showed up, I could tell something was off. She had this weird energy about her, like she was expecting a fight but didn't know when it was coming. I asked her to sit down, and as soon as I started talking, I saw the look in her eyes change. She went from confused to defensive in an instant. I told her I couldn't do it anymore, that I couldn't keep putting up with her toxic behavior. I explained how I felt suffocated and emotionally drained, how it wasn't healthy for either of us to keep pretending things were okay. She didn't take it well, not at all. At first, she got quiet. I thought maybe she was processing it, but nope, she was just getting angrier. It happened so fast I almost couldn't keep up. 1 second, she was sitting there, the next, she was standing and walking toward me. I didn't know what to expect. But then, out of nowhere, she spat at me, right on my chest. I froze. I couldn't believe it. Who does that? Who spits at someone during a breakup? I didn't know if I should be disgusted or just shocked into silence. I wiped it off and looked at her, but she wasn't even apologizing. Instead, she started yelling at me, calling me names, saying I was the problem, and that she'd never love me anyway. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, she pulled out her phone. At that point, I realized she wasn't just upset, she was about to escalate things. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew I had to get out of there. Then she did something that made my stomach drop. She called her brother. And not just a casual call. She was practically screaming into the phone, saying things like, "He's here, he's gonna get it." I couldn't make out all the details, but I could hear the anger in her voice. Her brother and I had never gotten along, but I never thought it'd go this far. He wasn't some big guy or anything, but he had this reputation for getting into fights, for always stirring up trouble. And now it seemed like he was about to take that trouble to my doorstep. As soon as Goji hung up the phone, she gave me a look, almost like she was daring me to leave. Not even 5 minutes later, I heard banging at my door. I looked through the peephole, and sure enough, there he was, her brother, standing outside with this angry look on his face, pounding his fist against the door like he was ready to tear it down. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the cops, but part of me just wanted to handle it myself. I wasn't afraid of him. After all, I knew judo, and that was something I always taken seriously. I wasn't looking for a fight, but I also wasn't about to let him walk all over me. I opened the door before he could knock again, and as soon as I did, he lunged. His intention was obvious. He wanted to scare me, maybe he even land a hit to prove he was a bigger man. But I was quicker. I moved just enough to get out of his range, grabbed his arm, and flipped him over my shoulder. It wasn't a huge move, but it was effective. He hit the ground with a loud thud. For a second, he just lay there looking stunned like he couldn't believe it. I didn't want to fight him. I just wanted him to get the message and leave. But he wasn't about to back down. He got up quickly, looking embarrassed, more angry than hurt. He started yelling at me, trying to come at me again, but this time I was ready. I didn't give him a chance. I swept his legs out from under him, and this time when he hit the ground, he stayed there. He was gasping for breath, clearly embarrassed. After that, he didn't move. He stayed on the floor for a couple of seconds, glaring at me with pure hate in his eyes, before finally getting up and running down the stairs. I didn't chase him. I didn't need to. He was gone, and that was the only thing that mattered, but Goji. She was still in my apartment, watching everything unfold. She was silent now, almost like she couldn't believe what had just happened. She didn't even apologize for calling him or for what had gone down. At that point, I knew for sure I was making the right choice. I couldn't be around someone who would drag her family into something like that. Someone who could go from sweet to psycho in a second. I didn't need that kind of energy in my life anymore. I didn't speak to her again after that. I changed my locks that night, blocked her on everything, and didn't look back. It's crazy to think that one of the worst breakups I've ever had involved me literally fighting her brother off my doorstep, but that's how it went down. And honestly, I'm glad I'm out of that situation. Sometimes you just have to walk away, no matter how messy or dangerous it gets. Breaking up with Chris was supposed to be the hardest thing I'd ever done, but I never expected it to turn into something like this. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd end up calling the cops because of him, I'd have laughed in their face. But that's exactly what happened, and honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. We'd been together for a while, about 9 months. At first, everything was fine. He was sweet, caring, always looking out for me. I felt lucky. But as time went on, I started noticing little things. He'd get jealous if I hung out with friends, accuse me of talking to other guys when I wasn't even doing anything. At first, I thought it was just him being protective, but then it started feeling more like control. He wanted to know where I was at all times, who I was with, and what I was doing. If I didn't answer a text right away, he'd send a dozen more asking if I was ignoring him. It started to get to a point where I didn't feel like myself anymore. I was walking on eggshells and I hated it. I tried to talk to him about it a couple of times, but he'd always turn it around on me, making me feel like I was the one who didn't trust him. It became this vicious cycle. He'd get mad, I'd apologize, and then we'd go back to pretending everything was fine until it happened again. But this time I couldn't take it anymore. I had to end it. I knew I deserved better, and I couldn't live with the constant stress of trying to make him happy while losing myself in the process. I decided to break up with him at my apartment. I thought it would be the easiest way. It was quiet, private, and I thought maybe he'd take it better if we weren't in public. I didn't know how wrong I was. The second I told him I wanted to break up, he lost it. I'm talking full meltdown. He started accusing me of cheating, saying I was lying to him about who I was talking to. I was confused at first because, no, I wasn't cheating. I wasn't even talking to anyone else in that way. But he didn't believe me. He was convinced, and nothing I said could change his mind. It was like a switch flipped. He went from angry to threatening. At first, it was subtle. He kept saying things like, "You'll regret this," and "You think you can just walk away, but you don't know what I'll do." It was that kind of vague threat that didn't feel like something you could take seriously, but at the same time, you knew it wasn't a good sign. I told him to leave, that we were done, and I didn't want to argue about it anymore, but he didn't listen. Instead, he started pacing around my living room, running his hands through his hair like he was losing control. I was sitting on the couch trying to stay calm, but inside I was freaking out. This wasn't the Chris I knew. I didn't know what to expect from him anymore. Eventually he left, but not without saying a final line that stuck with me. "I'll make you regret this. You're not getting away that easily." The next few hours were the longest of my life. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, wondering if he'd show up again. I didn't think he'd come back right away, but I also didn't trust that he was done. Sure enough, around 9 p.m., I heard loud banging on my door. My heart dropped to my stomach. I froze, staring at the door like if I didn't move, maybe he'd go away. But the banging didn't stop. It was getting harder, faster, like he was trying to break the door down. I stood up slowly, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to confront him. I didn't want things to escalate. I grabbed my phone, my mind racing. What was he going to do? Was he going to try to get inside? I felt trapped, like there was nowhere to go and I was alone. I called the police. I wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do at first, but I knew I had to get help. I couldn't handle him alone. I explained the situation, told them he was outside my door making threats, and that I was scared. I could hear the officer on the other end of the line telling me to stay inside, lock the doors, and that help was on the way. As soon as I hung up, the banging on the door got louder. He was screaming now, calling me every name under the sun, demanding that I let him in. I backed away from the door, a heart pounding. What if he broke through? What if he did something worse than just banging? My mind was racing with all the worst-case scenarios. I couldn't help but feel trapped. All I wanted was for him to leave, to let me live my life in peace, but it seemed like he wasn't going to give up that easily. Finally, after what felt like hours, the police arrived. They came in with their sirens blaring, and by that point, Chris had finally stopped banging on the door. I heard him cursing outside, but it wasn't as frantic as before. When the officers went outside to talk to him, I stayed inside, trying to steady my breathing. A few minutes later, they came back and told me that Chris had left the area. They also said they would file a report and advise me to get a restraining order. I didn't hesitate. I knew I had to do it. The next day, I went to court and got the restraining order. It felt surreal walking into that courtroom, standing there, knowing I had to take legal steps to keep myself safe. I never thought I'd be in that position. But as soon as I got that order in my hand, it was like a huge weight was lifted. I knew I was doing what I had to do to protect myself. After everything settled down, Chris didn't reach out again. I blocked him on all social media, changed my number, and tried to move on with my life. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he was capable of something more. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't called the cops, if I hadn't gotten the restraining order. It was a wake-up call. Sometimes people don't know how to let go, and that's when things get dangerous. I haven't heard from him since, and I'm hoping it stays that way. But the whole experience left me feeling more cautious, more aware of the red flags I didn't see before. I still don't understand why people do the things they do when they're hurt, but I do know that I don't owe anyone an explanation for taking care of myself. You ever feel like the universe just catches you at the worst possible time? I broke up with Diana a couple of months ago, and I can't stop thinking about how everything went down. It was supposed to be simple, a clean break, no hard feelings, just move on. But instead, it turned into one of those situations you see in movies, only way worse. Diana and I had been together for almost a year. In the beginning, I thought she was amazing. She was funny, caring, everything seemed perfect. But after a few months, I started noticing the little things. She'd get distracted when we were hanging out, barely respond to texts, and cancel plans at the last minute. I tried talking to her about it, but she'd always brush it off or say she was just stressed with work or school. I wanted to believe her. I did. But the more time went on, the more I started feeling like I was just not a priority. Then I caught her. I had been feeling off about everything for a while, so I did something I'm not proud of. I went through her phone, and no, I don't recommend it, but at that point, I was desperate to figure out what was going on. And sure enough, I found messages, a bunch of them, from some guy she'd been texting for weeks. They were talking about meeting up about plans to hang out when I wasn't around. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore what I saw. There was no mistaking it. She was cheating on me. I didn't confront her immediately. I spent a few days in this weird limbo trying to wrap my head around it. I wasn't angry yet. I was just numb. I guess I needed time to process everything. I didn't want to be the kind of person who would make an impulsive decision in the heat of the moment, but I also knew I couldn't keep pretending like nothing was wrong. The day I broke up with her, I just knew it had to happen. I couldn't be in a relationship where I felt completely ignored and lied to. So I asked her to come over to my place that afternoon. I wanted to have an honest conversation, even though I was already pretty sure of what I had to do. When she showed up, I could tell something was off with her too. She was acting distant, like she knew something was coming, but she didn't know what. I started the conversation calmly. I told her how I'd been feeling for a while, about how she'd changed, and how I felt I was being pushed aside. I didn't mention the cheating at first. I wanted to see if she'd tell me, if she'd come clean without me saying anything. But instead of admitting what she'd done, she got defensive. She started talking about how stressed she was with school and how she was dealing with a lot of personal stuff. I didn't buy it. I had seen the messages. I already knew what was going on, and so I told her. I knew she'd been texting that guy and meeting up with him behind my back. I was so calm about it, probably too calm, like I had already made peace with everything. And that's when everything went sideways. I thought she'd get mad, maybe cry, or even apologize. But instead, she did something I didn't expect. She started crying, but it wasn't the I'm sorry kind of crying. It was more like the kind where someone tries to make you feel guilty for something they did. She kept saying things like, "This is all your fault, and you pushed me to do this." And it was like a switch flipped in my head. I was completely thrown off. I wasn't expecting her to blame me. I mean, sure, there had been moments where I wasn't the perfect boyfriend, but nothing that justified cheating. I didn't know how to respond at first. I stood there, kind of frozen, while she cried and ranted about how I'd never paid enough attention to her, how I'd ignored her needs, how I was never there when she needed me. It was like she completely shifted the blame onto me, making me feel like I was the one who drove her into another guy's arms. She kept going on, and as much as I wanted to argue with her to defend myself, I realized something. This wasn't a conversation anymore. This was a manipulation tactic. She wasn't owning up to what she did. She was trying to make me feel guilty, like I was the one who had ruined everything. I didn't buy it, but it was still messing with my head. It's a weird feeling when someone you loved turns everything around and makes you question yourself. I kept telling her that what she did was wrong, that I didn't deserve to be treated like that, but she wasn't listening. She was too caught up in her own version of the story. Eventually, I knew I had to get her to leave. I told her it was over, that there was no going back. She wasn't hearing me. She begged me to reconsider, but I just couldn't. I was done. She didn't respect me or our relationship, and I wasn't about to keep fighting for someone who had already checked out emotionally. But she wasn't done yet. After she left, I thought I was free. But no, she started texting me like crazy, trying to guilt trip me some more, saying I was the one ruining her life, that she'd never trust anyone again because of me. I blocked her, but she kept calling, kept messaging. It felt like she was trying to drag me back into the mess she created. Then came the real kicker. A week later, I started getting weird texts from her friends. They didn't directly mention the breakup, but they kept saying things like, "You should have talked to her more," and she's really broken up about this. It was like they were all on this idea that I had somehow been the bad guy in all of this. Diana had painted me as the villain to everyone around her, and now I was dealing with her trying to turn my friends and family against me. I didn't know what else to do. I kept my distance and tried to keep my life moving forward, but it was hard. Every time I thought I was done with her, she would find a way to drag me back in, twisting the narrative to make herself look like the victim. It was draining, honestly. It's been a couple of months now since we broke up, and it still messes with me. I don't know what I expected when I ended things, but it wasn't this. I thought I'd just get some closure and move on, but it feels like I'm still dealing with the aftermath. I learned the hard way that people are capable of twisting reality to fit their own narrative. And for some reason, Diana couldn't accept responsibility for what she did. She had to make me the bad guy. Looking back, I know I did the right thing by breaking up with her, but the whole situation still feels like a weird dream I can't shake. I still don't understand how it escalated this way. It was supposed to be a normal breakup, just a clean cut and moving on like any other relationship. But I had no idea what Fatima was capable of. The worst part, she didn't even stop there. She kept digging the hole deeper for both of us. Fatima and I had been dating for almost 6 months. At first, it was great. She was fun, spontaneous, always up for anything. I loved the way she kept me on my toes, always talking about dreams and what we could do in the future. But after a while, I started to notice the cracks. She got possessive, like really possessive. She tracked my social media like a hawk, making sure I wasn't talking to any other girls. She'd get upset if I hung out with friends without her, and if I didn't answer her texts right away, I'd get this flood of angry messages. At first, I thought it was just a phase that maybe she was insecure. But it didn't stop. It only got worse. I found myself being more careful about what I posted on Instagram or Facebook, making sure she wouldn't see something that would set her off. That's when I realized I wasn't happy anymore. I was walking on eggshells, and that's never a good sign. When I decided to break up with her, it felt like the right thing to do. I couldn't deal with the constant stress anymore. I tried to explain things as gently as I could, told her that I wasn't in a good place and needed space, but she didn't take it well. I expected her to get upset, maybe cry, but I didn't expect what came next. A few days after our breakup, I was at the gym, my usual routine. I've been hitting the weights hard lately, trying to clear my head after the mess with Fatima. I'd been going to the same gym for a while, and I'd made friends with the staff, including the manager, Jason. Jason was a cool guy, maybe a few years older than me, always cracking jokes and keeping the vibe in the gym light. That day, I was in the middle of a deadlift set when Jason came up to me. He looked a little serious, which was unusual for him. He leaned in a little and said something that still makes my stomach turn. "Hey man, I need to talk to you for a sec." I figured something had gone wrong with my membership, or maybe there was a gym policy I didn't know about, but I didn't expect him to say what he did next. He pulled me aside and said that Fatima had come in earlier that day. I thought it was a bit odd considering the breakup, but I figured she just wanted to get some exercise. But then he hit me with a bombshell. She told him I'd gotten her pregnant. I don't think I've ever felt so stunned in my life. I remember standing there, just trying to process what I was hearing. Pregnant? What? I was honestly at a loss for words. Jason could see I was confused. I could tell he was trying to figure out what was going on too. "Yeah, man. She said you were being sketchy about it, but she wanted to get it off her chest. She's looking for your support now," he explained. At first, I thought Jason had misunderstood, or maybe Fatima had just misinterpreted things. But then I realized she was serious. She had gone to the gym, a place where I spent most of my time, and told Jason that I was the father of her child. The truth was, we hadn't even gotten that far in our relationship. We hadn't talked about having kids or anything like that. So for her to make this claim, it was completely out of the blue and completely false. I had no idea where she was even coming from. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just ignore it because now Jason was looking at me differently. I'd known him for months, and I wasn't about to let some crazy lie make him think I was some irresponsible jerk. So I took a step back, trying to process what was happening. I tried calling Fatima, but she didn't pick up. I sent her a few texts asking her why she was doing this, but I got no response. That's when I realized this wasn't just about us breaking up. It was something much deeper. She wasn't just upset about the breakup. She was going to try and make me look bad to everyone I knew. The next few days were a blur. Jason came to me a couple of times, saying he'd heard from other people in the gym about what Fatima had said. The worst part, she had even gotten some of her friends involved, telling them that I was refusing to take responsibility for a child I never even knew existed. By the time I spoke to a few of them, I realized that Fatima wasn't just telling one person. She was telling anyone who would listen. She had been telling people at my gym at work, even friends I hadn't spoken to in months. At this point, I was fuming, but I knew I couldn't just let her get away with it. I called up my lawyer. I had to protect myself. I had to stop the spread of these lies before they ruined my reputation. The lawyer told me that we could file a defamation suit and also get a cease and desist letter sent to her if she didn't stop spreading this nonsense. In the meantime, I took action with the gym. Jason and I talked more, and he admitted that Fatima had told him that I'd been avoiding her and making her feel like she was alone. He seemed to believe her, at least at first, but after talking it over with him, I gave him my side of the story, and he started to understand what was going on. I asked him if he could clear things up with the staff, which he did. But even with that, I couldn't stop the damage she was doing. By the time I managed to get things under control with the gym, rumors had already spread to people I didn't even know. I didn't even feel comfortable going back to the gym for a few weeks. Everywhere I went, it felt like people were watching me, waiting for me to slip up or admit something I hadn't done. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was downright creepy. Eventually, Fatima tried to contact me again. She apologized, or at least pretended to, but it felt like it was more about trying to get me to take the blame for her mess. She never once admitted she was wrong for what she did. I told her flat out that I wanted nothing to do with her. I wasn't going to keep playing her game, and I wasn't going to let her destroy my life. The whole situation messed with me for a while. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, trying to tear things down because she couldn't accept the breakup. It took a long time for me to fully recover from everything she did. And here's the kicker. I never even got to find out what made her do it. What made her think lying about a pregnancy would solve anything? Maybe I'll never know. But I learned the hard way that some people will stop at nothing to make you look bad, even when they're the ones in the wrong. I never thought it would end like this. You always imagine these breakups going down a certain way. Maybe it's awkward, maybe it's sad, but never like this. Not in a million years. The truth is, I still don't even know what happened. All I know is that I made the mistake of breaking up with Trina, and everything after that is a blur of chaos, screams, and shattered glass. It started normal enough, or at least I thought it was. We'd been together for a little over a year, and I had started feeling like things were off. I didn't feel the same, and I couldn't shake the thought that maybe I was just going through the motions. Maybe I was being selfish, maybe I wasn't strong enough to admit it sooner. But I had enough time to think about it, and there was no way around it. I couldn't lie to her anymore, or to myself. The plan was simple. Sit her down, be honest, try to be respectful. I mean, I was nervous as hell, but I thought I could handle it. After all, she was smart, calm, a little intense at times. But we were both adults, right? I thought we could work through this like adults, just talk about it and move on. We were in her apartment when I told her. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small two-bedroom place on the edge of town. Nothing too impressive, but it was hers. And it was where we spent most of our time together. I remember sitting on the couch, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to figure out how to say the words without totally wrecking everything. She was on the other side of the room, scrolling at her phone. It wasn't the most romantic of settings, but I figured it would be less awkward if we just kept things low-key. I told her. I told her we were done, that I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine when it wasn't. I wasn't happy. She wasn't happy. We both knew it, and I figured it would be better to just rip off the Band-Aid. Her face changed, not immediately, but slowly. I thought maybe she'd be sad, or maybe she'd get angry and then get over it. But I wasn't ready for what came next. At first, she stayed quiet. Too quiet. I thought maybe she was trying to process it or figure out how to respond. But then she started shaking her head like she couldn't even believe what I was saying. "Are you serious?" she finally whispered. It was barely a breath, and I didn't know if it was disbelief or just shock. I tried to explain myself, tried to make it make sense, but she wasn't hearing any of it. She was already standing up now, walking around the living room. And that's when it started. The first thing she threw was her pillow. It wasn't much, but I guess it was enough to send some kind of signal because after that, everything went downhill. She grabbed a coffee mug from the table and hurled it at the wall with such force that it exploded on impact. It wasn't just frustration. It was like she was unraveling right in front of me. I tried to stay calm, tried to stay collected. This wasn't who she was, or at least I didn't think it was. But there was no stopping it now, she was just getting started. It wasn't just the throwing, she started screaming. Not at me, though. It wasn't directed at me. It was like she was screaming at the universe, at the whole damn situation, like she was furious at the fact that we were even in this position. I wanted to help, I wanted to calm her down, but I didn't know how. She started knocking over everything, books, vases, anything she could grab. The apartment was small, so everything was crammed into tight spaces. As she threw things, they crashed into the walls, the floor, each other. It wasn't a tantrum anymore. This wasn't the Trina I knew. The woman who could joke around and laugh at herself. No, this was something else. And then she snapped. She turned to me with this wild look in her eyes, something completely alien to me. There was no logic in her gaze, no reasoning. I could see it now. The fury, the disbelief, the broken pieces of someone who had just been torn apart. It wasn't me she was mad at anymore. It was the world. It was everything that had led to this moment. I backed up as she came toward me, her hands outstretched, like she wanted to grab something, anything to throw. I couldn't think straight. I didn't want to hurt her, but I also didn't want to get hit with something sharp. I tried to say something, anything, but my words didn't land. She was too far gone, spiraling into this frenzy, this manic episode. I could hear her breathing now, heavy, uneven. And just when I thought maybe she was calming down, she spotted a framed photo on the shelf. It was one of us from a few months ago, a day at the beach, smiling. She grabbed it with both hands and smashed it against the floor, the glass shattering into 1,000 little pieces. I don't know what came over me, I shouted. I told her to stop, to just stop already. I told her I was sorry, I didn't mean to hurt her, that I never wanted this to happen. But she wasn't listening. She wasn't even looking at me anymore. She was lost in her own rage. The room was a mess, pieces of her things scattered all over the place, the walls covered in cracks from where things had slammed into them. I just stood there, frozen, not knowing what the hell to do. And then she stopped. Not because she was done, but because she just ran out of things to throw. The silence after it all was deafening. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of it. She was breathing heavily, standing by the door, looking at me with this blank stare like everything had already been said and done. I tried to apologize again, but it didn't matter. She didn't say a word. She walked out of the room, her steps heavy, the door slamming behind her. That was the last time I saw her. I thought I was rid of her, but even now, months later, I still hear her sometimes. In the middle of the night, I swear I hear things. Things being thrown, glass breaking, that scream echoing in my head. It's like she's still there, somewhere haunting me. But I know it's over. The destruction is done. What's left? Just a mess. It was like any other Friday night, or at least it was supposed to be. The sky outside was clear, and I was curled up on my couch with a bowl of popcorn, ready to binge watch some Netflix. Things had been kind of off with Luke lately, but I didn't think much of it. We'd been together for about 6 months, and sure, we had our issues, mostly him being glued to his phone, ignoring me when I tried to talk about something serious, his weird obsession with keeping up appearances on social media. But honestly, I figured that was just how relationships went. You worked through it, right? Or at least, that's what everyone told me. But then, out of nowhere, he texted me. He said he needed to talk. I immediately knew what it was about. He'd been distant for weeks. So I agreed to meet up. He chose this little cafe down the street from my place, a spot where we'd always go to get away from the chaos of his followers, constantly bombarding him with messages. I had no idea that this would be the last time I'd see him, at least in the way I thought I knew him. When we met, Luke looked calm, way too calm. I'd expected the usual nervous energy, the awkward stutter that came with breaking up with someone, but there was none of that. Instead, he sat across from me like we were just two friends catching up. The conversation started off typical enough. He said he was just too busy with his social media stuff, that his life had gotten too complicated, and that he thought it would be best if we ended things. At first, I was hurt, but I understood. He had a lot on his plate. He was an influencer, I guess I just wasn't part of the equation anymore. He told me it wasn't about me, but about how much his online presence was demanding his attention. It was weird, but I didn't get upset right away. I tried to cue it together, tell him that I understood and that it was okay. Honestly, I figured he'd feel the same way eventually. Like, maybe we'd still stay friends. But then things took a turn. The second we left the cafe, it was like he switched. He went from calm and collected to cold and cruel, almost like he was trying to prove something. He barely said goodbye before he walked off, leaving me standing there feeling confused and alone. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came the next day. It started with a tweet, just a simple post with a picture of me and him at some event we went to a couple of months ago, but it wasn't the picture that got to me. It was a caption. He wrote something like, "Sometimes you think you know someone, and then you realize they're just another fake person using you for clout. Can't believe I wasted my time. I didn't even know how to react. I thought it was a joke at first, maybe some kind of weird post-breakup catharsis. But then the comments started rolling in. Sorry, dude, she was just using you to boost her numbers. She never really cared about you, you could tell. Good riddance, bro. She was toxic. My phone started blowing up with people tagging me in the posts, sharing it with their friends. I didn't even know what to do with myself. I felt humiliated, violated, like I was being dragged through the mud by someone I thought I knew. Luke's followers, who had always been super chill with me, supportive even, now were attacking me in the most subtle but cutting ways. It was like he was making me the villain in our breakup story, twisting it into something completely different from what had actually happened. I figured maybe he was just upset and would calm down after a few days. But no, it got worse. The next morning, he posted a video. It was a live stream, and his followers flooded in like a wave. I wasn't ready for what I saw. Luke was sitting in front of the camera, looking dead serious, like he was about to drop some major truth bomb on the world. He started talking about how people needed to be careful who they let into their lives, how easy it was to get taken advantage of by people who pretend to care. And then, without any warning, he said, "So, yeah, about my ex, let's just say she wasn't who she said she was. She was always more interested in how I could help her career than anything real." My stomach dropped. The more he talked, the more I felt like I was suffocating. He painted this picture of me as some opportunistic, attention-hungry person who only cared about his fame and followers. It was complete nonsense. But the worst part, he wasn't even trying to have a real conversation with me about it. He was just using his platform to tear me down, to make me look like the villain in front of thousands of people. It didn't stop there either. Luke started posting screenshots of old conversations we'd had, some of which were taken completely out of context. He cherry-picked things I said, twisting them in ways that made me seem manipulative or fake. It wasn't just online harassment anymore. It was like he was making me a target for all of his followers to go after. I tried to reach out to him, tried to call him, text him, but he ignored me. It was like he wanted me to feel completely powerless. I even started getting messages from people who had no business being involved, people who didn't know me, telling me how lucky I was that someone like Luke even noticed me in the first place. People who had never met me were coming for me. I had to make my account private, but the damage had already been done. Luke's followers had already seen the posts, already started to talk about me behind my back. They shared his video, spread his message like wildfire. It felt like there was no escape. I started losing followers too, which I guessed is normal in the social media world when something like this happens. But what hurt the most wasn't the numbers, it was the betrayal. He'd taken something private, something that should have been between the two of us, and turned it into this massive spectacle. Like, for what? To make himself look like the victim. To get sympathy from people who barely even knew him. It didn't end overnight. It dragged on for weeks, and for weeks I felt like I was living in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I would get random DMs from people calling me names, accusing me of things I hadn't even done. Luke kept pushing his narrative, and I couldn't stop it. He was so far gone from the person I thought I knew, so caught up in his image and his followers that I barely recognized him anymore. Eventually, I had the courage to leave social media for good, at least for a while. I had to. I couldn't keep living like that. The worst part, I never even got a real apology. It was just him, in front of his camera, telling the world how weak I was for letting things go public. He never saw how much he hurt me. I still think about Luke sometimes, but now it's just a reminder of how easily people can change when they're wrapped up in their own image. I never really got closure, and maybe I never will, but I don't need it. I've moved on. I just hope one day he'll wake up and realize what he did. I'll never forget the look on her face. It's not something I think about every day, but it's there, haunting me whenever I find myself alone, staring at the walls in the quiet of my apartment. I know I shouldn't feel guilty. I was just doing what felt right for me. But the way Polly reacted, it wasn't supposed to go down like that. It all started in that coffee shop, the one with the mismatched chairs and the smell of fresh pastries that always made you feel like you were in a scene from a romantic movie. I had been there countless times before, sitting across from Polly, talking about our future, making plans, laughing over stupid inside jokes. But that day, everything changed. It wasn't that I woke up thinking, today's the day I break up with Polly. It wasn't like that at all. In fact, I've been trying to avoid it for weeks. Polly had always been so sweet, so caring, and she was incredibly loyal, maybe too loyal. The problem was, somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't as in love with her as I thought. I started feeling trapped, like I couldn't breathe. We didn't have the same interests anymore, and I found myself drifting away while she held on tighter and tighter. But I didn't want to hurt her. She had this way of looking at me like I was the only person who truly understood her. I didn't want to be the guy who broke her heart, but at some point I knew I had to. And as much as I hated to admit it, I'd been putting it off for way too long. So there we were sitting at our usual table in the corner. She was sipping on her iced latte, chatting about some new show she was watching, and I could barely concentrate. Every time she smiled or laughed, I could feel this pit growing in my stomach. I had to do it. I had to end it. I started talking slowly, trying to break it to her gently. I thought if I just explained things, maybe it wouldn't be so bad. But the second I said, "I think we need to talk," her expression shifted. I could see the confusion in her eyes, the little spark of hope that maybe I just meant we needed to talk about something stupid, like work or a new movie. Then I told her it wasn't working anymore, that I didn't feel the same way, that we were better off apart. The words didn't sound real coming out of my mouth. It was like I was watching someone else say them, someone who was completely detached from the situation. But the look on her face made everything so much more real than I was ready for. At first, Polly just stared at me. She didn't cry, she didn't yell. She didn't even speak. She just froze. I could see her hands trembling as she set her coffee cup down, like she was trying to process what I had just said. But there was something off about her reaction. It wasn't the sadness I expected. It wasn't anger either. It was like she was starting to fade out of the moment, like she wasn't even in the room anymore. I tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled it away quickly. I don't know why that small movement hit me so hard. Maybe it was because it felt like she was already trying to shut me out, like she was preparing for something much worse than I ever could have imagined. She started breathing faster, and at first I didn't get it. I thought maybe she was just shocked or upset, but then her breath became shallow, ragged. Her chest was rising and falling too quickly, and I could see the panic start to set in. Her eyes were darting around like she was searching for something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing. I leaned forward, trying to get her attention, asking her if she was okay. She didn't respond, but her hand gripped the edge of the table like she was trying to anchor herself. Her fingers were turning white from the pressure. Her lips were pale, and for a moment I thought maybe she was about to pass out. But then she took in another sharp breath, one that sounded more like a gasp. The thing was, I didn't know what to do. I'd never seen Polly like this before. She was always so put together, always so in control of her emotions. This wasn't the girl I'd known for months. She was slipping away from me right there in front of my eyes, and I felt completely useless. It was like I was watching her drown, and all I could do was sit there, helpless, saying stupid things like, "Hey, just breathe. It's okay, Polly." But it wasn't okay. Nothing about it was okay. I was the one who caused this. I had broken her. Her breathing started to speed up even more. She looked like she was choking, her face turning a shade of red that I hadn't seen on her before. I panicked. I stood up, unsure of what to do. My mind was racing, thinking I should call someone, get help, but I couldn't get my thoughts together. I should have been there for her, should have helped her calm down. Instead, I froze. I kept thinking that maybe she would snap out of it, but she didn't. The next thing I knew, she slumped forward, knocking over her coffee cup. The sound of it hitting the table echoed through the quiet cafe. Everything went still for a moment. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. Her face hit the table with a soft thud. I reached for her immediately, my hands shaking as I gently tried to lift her head. She wasn't moving. Her skin was cold and her eyes were closed, but her breathing had slowed, thank God. It wasn't fast and shallow anymore. It was more even, but still, something felt wrong. I didn't know what to do. I ran to the counter, yelling for someone to help, but the barista just stared at me, clearly not understanding the urgency. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911, and watched as Polly's body lay there, limp. The seconds felt like hours. I kept trying to wake her up, slapping her cheek lightly, calling her name, but there was no response. Finally, after what felt like forever, the paramedics showed up. They took over immediately, checking her pulse, putting an oxygen mask on her face. I stood back, useless, just watching them work on her, praying she'd come back to me, that she'd wake up and be okay. Polly came to after what seemed like an eternity. She was disoriented at first, but when she saw me standing there, looking completely panicked, she asked if I was okay. I almost couldn't believe it. She just fainted from a mental breakdown, and she was asking if I was okay. That was Polly. Always concerned about others, even when she was falling apart herself. They took her to the hospital, and I went with her, of course. But I kept thinking about how I'd broken her, how my decision to end things had pushed her to that point. She had always been sensitive, always so open with her emotions. And I had been the one to hurt her, to put her in a place where she couldn't breathe, literally and figuratively. I'll never be able to erase the image of her slumped in that coffee shop, completely out of it, her face pale, her body so still. I never saw Polly again after that day. She needed space. She needed to heal. And I don't blame her. I don't think I'll ever forget that moment, that feeling of complete helplessness. It wasn't the breakup I expected. I thought it would be sad, maybe tearful, but nothing like this. Nothing that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I've never been more scared of someone in my life, and I've had some messed up relationships. But this was different. This one wasn't just awkward, it was terrifying. It all started when I finally decided I had to break up with Kevin. You know that moment when you've been putting something off for so long, and you think you can't possibly delay it any longer. That was me with Kevin. At first, he seemed like the perfect guy, charming, funny, always there when I needed him. But over time, it became clear he had this weird, possessive side. I started to feel trapped. He'd show up at my place unannounced, message me constantly, even when I told him I needed space. And don't even get me started on how he reacted whenever I'd mentioned taking a break from social media or seeing other people. He'd get this crazy look in his eyes, like he didn't want to let me breathe. The control was subtle at first, but eventually, it started feeling like I couldn't do anything without him watching or commenting on it. I knew I had to end it. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when I felt so suffocated. So one night after he left yet another voicemail that I'd ignored, I decided to do it. I texted him, asking if we could meet up at the cafe near my place. He said sure, and I spent the next hour pacing, trying to figure out the best way to get through it without making him explode. When I got to the cafe, he was already there, sitting at a table by the window. He looked calm, almost too calm, and as soon as I walked in, he waved me over like we were just going to chat about the weather or some random thing. I don't know what I expected, but this definitely wasn't it. My nerves were shot, but I sat down anyway, trying to act normal. I didn't want to drag it out, so I said it. I told him I couldn't do this anymore, that I needed space and I wanted to end things. I thought he'd be hurt or maybe even angry, but not the way it turned out. At first, Kevin just laughed, like full-on chuckle like I had told him the funniest joke in the world. He actually laughed at me, right in the middle of a conversation where I was trying to explain that I felt trapped, like everything was falling apart. It threw me off so much that I didn't even know how to respond. I just sat there staring at him, wondering if he was messing with me or if this was his weird way of dealing with something he didn't like hearing. But the more I watched him laugh, the more I realized he wasn't joking. I tried to tell him I was serious. I started getting upset, trying to explain that this wasn't something I was just throwing out there for attention. I was done. But instead of backing off, he leaned back in his chair, still laughing like I was some kind of joke to him. That's when it hit me. He didn't take me seriously at all. He thought I was just playing around, trying to get attention or mess with his head. I had seen him act immature before, but this was next level. But then it changed. I don't know if something in his brain finally clicked, but when he realized I wasn't going to back down, his whole demeanor shifted. It wasn't the calm, collected guy I've been sitting across from anymore. Suddenly, he was tense, his jaw clenching, his eyes narrowing. He stopped laughing so abruptly that it felt like the room had been sucked of air. I remember the exact moment when he stopped smiling. He just froze. His voice got cold. He leaned in closer, his hands clenched into fists on the table. I started to feel a shift in the atmosphere, like the air got thick and hard to breathe. I could tell he was holding something back, what I didn't know what. At first, I thought maybe he was just upset, but then the words came out of his mouth and I felt the real danger. He didn't yell. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The way he spoke was slow, controlled, calculated. But that's what made it worse. It wasn't the rage that scared me. It was the way he could hide it so well, like he knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't crying or begging me to stay. No, he was threatening me, and it took me a second to really process it. He started talking about how I'd never find anyone like him, how I was making a huge mistake, how I'd regret this decision. He said I was wasting his time, that I'd never be able to handle being alone, and that if I left, I wouldn't be able to come back. But it wasn't just words. I could see the anger in his eyes. It was like something in him snapped when he realized I wasn't joking around. Then it got worse. He stood up so suddenly that it made me flinch, and for a second, I thought he was going to grab me. But instead, he started pacing around the small cafe, muttering to himself under his breath. I could hear him breathing heavily, like he was struggling to keep himself together. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the heat in my face, and my hands were shaking. I just wanted to get out of there. I didn't know what he was capable of anymore. Was he going to hurt me? Was he going to stalk me? When he turned to face me again, I saw the shift in his eyes. The last traces of calm were gone, replaced by something darker. His expression twisted into this kind of sneer, like he had completely lost it. He started saying how if I left him, I'd regret it. How no one would ever want me once they knew the truth about who I really was. He said it like he was trying to break me down, trying to make me feel worthless, like it ruined his life by simply wanting out of the relationship. I was scared. I didn't know what was going on, but something told me I needed to leave before it escalated further. I grabbed my purse, stood up quickly, and tried to walk toward the door, but he blocked my way. I'll never forget the look in his eyes then. It wasn't anger anymore, it was insane. He was so close to me that I could feel the heat coming off his body, smell the sweat in his shirt. It was like he was a different person altogether. He told me that if I ever tried to move on or see someone else, he'd make sure I paid for it. He said some other things too, but honestly, I couldn't focus on all of them. My mind was running a mile a minute, and all I could think was that I needed to get out of there fast. I pushed past him, practically running to the door. He didn't follow, but I could still feel his eyes on me as I walked out of the cafe. My hands were shaking, my legs felt like they were going to give out, and my heart was hammering in my chest. It took everything I had to keep it together long enough to make it to my car and drive off. I blocked his number that night, and he never tried to contact me again. But for weeks after that, I kept looking over my shoulder, afraid he might show up at my door or find some way to get to me. It wasn't just a breakup that haunted me, it was the sudden, unpredictable change in him. It was like I had unlocked a part of him I couldn't control. It terrified me. I don't know what would have happened if I stayed, or if I let him talk me out of it. But I don't care to find out. What I learned from that night was that sometimes people can be different in ways you don't expect. And when that change happens, you can't always predict what comes next. I'll never forget the night I broke up with Laura. It wasn't just a typical breakup. No, this one was different. The kind of thing that makes you question whether or not you really know someone. And that night, I learned that you don't always know who you're dealing with, especially when you're dealing with someone who has connections you didn't even know about. So let me start at the beginning. Laura and I had been dating for about 6 months, and to be honest, I was starting to feel like I was in way over my head. When we first met, everything was great. She was sweet, funny, and always seemed to know exactly what to say to make me feel better. But as time went on, I started noticing little things that bugged me, like how she would get jealous if I hung out with my friends too much, or how she always needed to know where I was and what I was doing. I thought it was just her being affectionate, but then it got controlling. One night, after a weird argument about me not answering her texts fast enough, I realized I couldn't do it anymore. I didn't want to feel suffocated. So I decided to end it. I figured it would be hard, of course, but at least it would be over. We met up at this cafe down the street from my place. It was quiet, low-key, and I thought it would be the perfect place to talk. I wasn't expecting things to get weird, at least not this weird. When I sat down across from her, she seemed kind of off. I don't know, maybe it was just me being anxious, but she didn't seem like her usual self. Her smile was tight, her eyes a little too focused. I tried to ease into the conversation, but as soon as I said it, that I wanted to break up, her whole demeanor changed. She went from being kind of distant to straight up cold. I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, rehearsing what I was going to say, trying to find a way to make it as painless as possible. But the moment the words left my mouth, something shifted in her. She didn't cry, didn't yell, just sat there staring at me. I could see her processing it like she couldn't quite believe it. For a second, I thought maybe I had made a huge mistake. Maybe I shouldn't have said it. Then, after a few long seconds of awkward silence, she pulled out her phone. I thought she was going to call her mom or something, but instead, she typed something quickly, her face getting more serious by the second. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was texting a friend, processing things in her own way. But then she looked up and I could tell she wasn't looking at me anymore. It was like she was staring through me like I didn't exist. And then the worst thing happened. She stood up, said nothing, and walked out of the cafe. I was so confused. I just sat there for a minute trying to figure out what the hell just happened. Did she get mad? Was she upset? Was she coming back? But as I sat there, I started to feel this weird tension in the air, like something was off. A few minutes later, I heard the door of the cafe open and walked this guy. I didn't recognize him at first, but then I saw him walking straight toward me. He was tall, maybe in his late 40s with a big build. His eyes locked on me, and for a second, I thought maybe he was just some random guy, but the way he was looking at me made me nervous. And then it hit me. This was her dad. I had no idea what to say. I didn't even know if he recognized me or knew who I was, but I had a feeling I wasn't about to get a "hey, nice to meet you" greeting. I don't know how to explain it, but everything about him screamed, "Don't mess with me." He sat down across from me without saying anything, just staring at me with this unsettling look on his face. My heart was racing. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, but the way he was looking at me made me feel like I was about to be accused of something I didn't even know about. After a minute, he spoke, but his voice wasn't what I expected. It was calm, controlled, almost too calm, like he practiced this 1,000 times in his head. At first, I couldn't even process what he was saying. It was like he was threatening me, but in a way that didn't make it obvious at first. He talked about how his daughter was very important to him, how I'd better not have hurt her, and how there would be consequences if I had. It wasn't so much what he said, it was the way he said it. His words were like daggers wrapped in velvet. Every sentence was meant to rattle me, to make me question everything I thought I knew about the situation. I tried to keep my cool, but I was honestly scared. This wasn't just some overprotective dad giving me a lecture. This guy had something about him that made my blood run cold. The way he spoke, how he kept leaning in closer, made me feel like I was in a corner. I started to sweat. My mouth went dry. I felt like I couldn't breathe. He didn't raise his voice or anything, but the more he spoke, the more I realized he wasn't going to let this go easily. I kept thinking about Laura, about how she'd just left and pulled this stunt with her dad. Was she in on it? Had she planned this? Was this some twisted way of getting back at me for breaking up with her? I tried to explain myself, to tell him that I hadn't done anything wrong, that I wasn't some monster who just walked away from his daughter without a second thought. But every time I said something, he would cut me off with another chilling remark. He'd say things like, "If I find out you've been hurting her in any way, you'll regret it, or you don't know who you're messing with." I couldn't tell if he was just trying to intimidate me or if he actually had some power that I didn't understand. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there. I don't even remember what I said back to him. I was too busy trying to figure out how to make an exit. The whole situation felt like a nightmare. Finally, after what felt like forever, he stood up, slapped a couple of bills on the table for my coffee, and said something like, "Don't ever contact my daughter again." Then, just like that, he walked out. I sat there in complete silence, trying to process everything. What had just happened? Was I really threatened by Laura's dad? What was his deal? I didn't know how to move on from that night. For days afterward, I kept looking over my shoulder, checking my phone to see if Laura would text or call. But she never did. I figured maybe her dad had scared her away from talking to me, or maybe she just didn't care. But the whole thing still sits with me. I never went back to that cafe, and I never tried to reach out to Laura again. Part of me wonders if she knew what kind of person her dad really was. And honestly, I don't think I ever want to find out. All I know is that sometimes breaking up with someone doesn't just mean walking away. Sometimes it means facing something much scarier than you expected. And that's exactly what happened with Laura. It all started when I broke up with George. I'd never expected it to turn into something out of a horror movie. But here I am, writing this down, trying to figure out how things went so wrong. Let me take you back to that day. It was a Saturday afternoon, and George and I had been together for about a year. Things had started to feel off for a while, though. I didn't feel like myself anymore. There were these constant little arguments, misunderstandings, and we just weren't clicking the way we used to. I knew I had to break it off, so I did. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud. I just told him it wasn't working, and I wanted to move on. Honestly, I thought we were both going to be fine with it. George seemed fine. He wasn't devastated or angry. He just nodded and said he understood. I figured we'd both go our separate ways, maybe a little sad for a while, but nothing too crazy. The next few days were weird, but it was the kind of weird that I thought would pass. I stayed busy with work, hung out with friends, and tried to get back to my normal life. But then, out of nowhere, it started. It started with a message on Instagram. The profile was anonymous, no pictures, no bio, just a username and message. At first, I thought it was some random person who had mistaken me for someone else, but the message didn't feel random. It was personal. They said they had something of mine. They didn't say exactly what it was at first, but they implied it was something I'd never want anyone to see. My stomach dropped when I read that. It felt like a gut punch, and for the first time I actually felt scared. I didn't know what they meant, but my mind started running through all the possible things it could be. Had someone taken a picture of me? Had I been stupid? I racked my brain trying to figure it out. The next day, the messages started to get worse. The person told me they had explicit photos of me, photos I never meant to share. They knew my full name, my school, and even details about my life that were way too specific to be random. They said they would leak everything unless I did what they wanted. I felt completely frozen. I didn't know how to react. I tried to brush it off at first, thinking maybe it was a prank. But the more they messaged me, the more I realized they were serious. They mentioned things about me that only George and I knew about. I could feel my heart racing. My mind was spinning. How could this person know all of this? Was it George? Had he somehow gotten his hands on my private photos? Or was it someone else? Maybe a friend of his, someone who knew we had broken up. I was in full panic mode now. I thought about blocking the account, but then the threats started coming through. The person said they had already shared one of the photos with some of my classmates, and if I didn't listen to them, they would send everything to my family. My heart dropped when I saw those messages. The thought of my family finding out about something like this terrified me. I didn't want them to know. At first, I didn't tell anyone. I thought I could handle it on my own, but the more the person messaged me, the more isolated I felt. I was terrified. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time I got a notification, my whole body would tense up. The messages were getting more demanding. They told me that I had to meet them, that I had to do whatever they said. I wasn't sure if it was some random troll or if it was someone I knew, but the fear kept building. I finally told one of my close friends, Emma. She freaked out, obviously, and suggested I go to the police, but I wasn't sure how much they could do. How could they prove anything? I didn't even know who was behind the account. But Emma insisted that I at least try. So I went down to the local station, explained everything, and they told me they'd look into it. But it didn't really make me feel any safer. The weirdest part, as soon as I went to the cops, the messages stopped coming from that anonymous account. It was like someone had known I'd taken action. I thought maybe they'd backed off because they were scared of getting caught. But that didn't stop the fear from hanging over me. A few days passed, and I started to let my guard down a little. But then one night, I was scrolling through my Instagram feed, and there it was. A post from a random account, not a private message this time, out in the open for everyone to see. It was a picture of me. A picture I knew I hadn't shared with anyone. It was old, taken back when George and I were still together. But how the hell did they get that? I couldn't breathe. The post had no caption, just the image. It wasn't explicit, but it was enough to make me feel completely exposed. I rushed to delete it, but when I checked, the account had already gone private. Too late. People had already seen it, and I knew the worst part wasn't even over. The person behind this had more, a lot more. I didn't know what to do anymore. My phone was blowing up with messages from people I hadn't heard from in ages, asking why my picture was all over social media, asking if I was okay. I felt humiliated, powerless. Then it hit me, could George have done this? Could he have been behind the whole thing? I thought back to when we'd broken up, how calm he'd seemed about everything. I remembered how he said he understood, how he said it was fine. But could he have been pretending? Had he been planning something like this all along? I couldn't shake the feeling that it was him. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became. No one else knew about the photos. No one else had that kind of access to my private life. The next day, I confronted him. Well, more like I sent him a message asking if he was behind it. I didn't think he'd admit to anything, but at least it would give me some kind of clarity. He didn't reply at first, but a few hours later, I got a message back. It was a single sentence. You should have thought about that before you broke up with me. That was all I needed to hear. My stomach twisted, and I felt the ground beneath me fall away. I was right. He was the one behind it. And now everything made sense. The calmness, the indifference. It was all a facade. I don't know how I let it get this far, but looking back, I feel like I should have seen the signs. The way he'd always try to control things, the way he manipulated me into thinking everything was my fault. It wasn't just a breakup. It was a power play. He wanted control, and when he couldn't have me anymore, he tried to destroy me instead. It's been a few months since that happened, and the situation has died down. The account was eventually taken down, and no one really talks about it anymore. But I still feel it. Every time my phone buzzes, every time someone new follows me on social media, I wonder if it's him watching, waiting. I don't know how he got those photos or how he orchestrated the whole thing, but I do know one thing. I'll never look at social media the same way again. And as for George, I don't know what happened to him after all that. I haven't heard from him since, but I don't care. I just want to move on and forget it all. I don't even know where to start with this one. It's one of those things that looking back, I can't even believe happened, but it did, and it messed with me in a way I'll never forget. So here it goes. I'd been dating Lena for a while, about a year or so, and for the most part, things were fine. We had our ups and downs, like every relationship, but it didn't feel like anything major. We both had our own things going on in life, but we made it work. I had just opened a small graphic design business a few months before we met, and things were slowly starting to pick up. It wasn't anything big, just a small operation out of my apartment, but I was building something that I was proud of. But the more I spent time with Lena, the more I started noticing things that didn't sit right with me. She was always a bit possessive, to be honest. If I worked late, she'd accuse me of not caring about her. If I went out with friends, she'd make it seem like I was abandoning her. But I didn't think much of it at first. I thought, hey, maybe it's just how she is. But after a while, it started feeling like she was slowly squeezing me out of my own life. She didn't want me spending time with anyone else, didn't want me going anywhere without her. And it wasn't like I was out here doing anything shady. It was just that my life seemed to be shrinking. It wasn't fun. Eventually, I couldn't take any more. I knew it wasn't going to work, so I made the call to end things. It was hard, obviously. I thought it would be the right thing to do. I tried to be as gentle as possible, explained how I felt, and told her it wasn't working out. The moment I said it, though, I could see the change in her. It wasn't the sad, understanding look I expected. No, it was like something shifted. Her eyes turned hard, and I could tell she wasn't taking it well. I tried to stay calm, but I felt like I was walking in eggshells. I didn't want a big scene. I thought, just get through it, let her get mad, and it'll blow over. That's when she said something that completely threw me off guard. She said she was going to sue me. My first thought was, what? I didn't even know how to process it. Sue me for what? I tried to wrap my head around it, but it didn't make sense. I was just a guy running a small business out of my apartment. What could she possibly have on me? She went on telling me that I had wronged her and damaged her reputation. At first, I thought she was just saying stuff to hurt me, but then she started talking specifics. She said I had promised her things during the relationship, things like trips, gifts, and financial support, and that I had lied about following through. She said she was embarrassed in front of her friends and family because of me, and that I had made her look foolish. It felt like I was being hit with a brick wall. I had never made any promises like that. We were just in a relationship, and I helped her out when I could, but there was never anything written down or anything that could be considered legal. But she wasn't backing down. She was adamant that I had manipulated her, and now she was going to take me to court. I tried to explain that we were just two people in a relationship, and sometimes things don't work out. But she wasn't listening. She kept talking about how her lawyer was already involved, how she had proof of all the things I had promised, even though none of it was real. It was all just some twisted version of events in her head. The threats didn't stop there. Over the next few days, Lena started sending me emails, text messages, and even calling me at all hours of the day. She was saying the same thing over and over. If you don't settle this, you'll lose your business. She kept saying she had screenshots of messages that proved I had misled her, and that she could easily make my reputation crumble if I didn't give her what she wanted. At first, I thought she was bluffing. I didn't think she would really go that far. But then one night, I got an email from a lawyer. It wasn't some random person either. It was a real lawyer with a firm, someone who sounded very official. The email said that they had evidence that I owed Lena money, and if I didn't settle, I would be facing a lawsuit. They mentioned the things Lena had told them, things I had never agreed to, and said that I could face severe financial penalties. Now I was panicking. This wasn't just an emotional outburst. She was actually serious about going to court. I didn't know what to do. I tried calling the lawyer, but they didn't pick up. I called Lena, but she wouldn't answer. It was like she had completely cut me off and was using some legal system to control the situation. I sat there for hours, staring at my phone, trying to figure out how to handle this. I kept thinking about my business, my dream. I had built it from the ground up, and now it was all on the line. The idea that some girl I had dated could destroy everything I worked for was terrifying. I didn't have the kind of money for a legal battle. I didn't have the connections. The threats kept coming. Every few hours, I'd get another email from her lawyer. Every message was more aggressive than the last. She said she was preparing a lawsuit, and if I didn't comply, she'd go public with everything. My business, my name, my personal life. She made it sound like the whole world would know about me, and I would be completely ruined. I started losing sleep over it. I couldn't focus on anything. I barely worked, barely ate. It was like I was living in constant fear. The worst part was not knowing when or if it would end. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would stop. Was it another threat? Was it her lawyer trying to get more money out of me? It all came to a head one night when I was having a breakdown at home. I was pacing around my apartment trying to figure out what to do when I got a notification from my website. My heart sank when I saw it. Someone had posted a review about my business. It wasn't a real review, but a completely fake one. It was full of lies about me, about how I was a scam artist and how I had stolen money from people. It was the kind of review that could easily tank a small business. And of course, the name on the review was Lena. That was the final straw. I couldn't handle it anymore. I didn't want to lose everything I had worked for, and I didn't want to keep living in fear. I reached out to a lawyer I knew, someone I trusted, and explained everything. After some back and forth, we managed to get Lena's lawyer to back down. The threat stopped, and the review was taken down, but I never fully felt safe again. I don't know what Lena thought she was going to achieve by doing all of that. I didn't understand why she had to go so far to hurt me. Maybe she thought she could force me to give her money, or maybe she just wanted to ruin me. Either way, it worked. It messed with me mentally, and for a long time, I couldn't shake the fear that something else would happen. I learned that breaking up with someone doesn't just mean walking away. Sometimes it comes with consequences you never expected. And for me, those consequences almost cost me everything. This story still messes with my head, and it's been months since it all went down. I never thought breaking up with someone could escalate to the point where I felt like I was in a horror movie, but here we are. I guess if you've ever had a crazy ex, you'll understand what I'm talking about. This one's definitely up there in the what the hell just happened category. So let me set the scene. I had been dating Dylan for about 8 months. He wasn't terrible at first, but as time went on, I started noticing how possessive and needy he was. He had this sort of desperate energy that rubbed me the wrong way. At first, I thought it was cute. He'd get jealous if I hung out with my friends, or if I didn't text him back right away. But it got worse. He'd show up at my work or send me paragraphs of texts when I wasn't giving him enough attention. It was like he was trying to lock me down, but not in a healthy way. I tried talking to him about it, telling him that I needed space, but he didn't get it. He'd apologize and promise he'd change, but it would last maybe a week before he'd slip back into the same old routine. I had enough. I couldn't keep doing this. I felt like I was suffocating, and the only way to breathe again was to let go. So one afternoon, I did what I thought was a mature thing. I told him I wanted to break up. I didn't want a huge fight, didn't want to drag things out. So I kept it simple. I thought I could just walk away, and that'd be it. But oh no, it wasn't that easy. At first, Dylan seemed okay. Like he didn't flip out immediately. He just kind of stared at me, and I thought, okay, maybe he's just processing it. But then he started pacing. I'm talking, full on pacing, like he was thinking of the best way to plead his case or something. Then it happened. Dylan stopped pacing, turned to face me, and started rapping. Yeah, you heard me right. This guy, who I thought was completely normal until this moment, started rapping in the middle of the coffee shop we were sitting at. He wasn't just spitting a verse or whatever. He was going off, like he was auditioning for a reality show or something. He was rapping about how I shouldn't leave him, how we were meant to be, how he'd do anything to fix things. The whole coffee shop was staring at us by this point. People were whispering, some were even filming on their phones. It was surreal. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. It wasn't like he was just standing there being emotional. No, he was out here performing in public. It was like he had turned the breakup into some kind of spectacle. The whole situation was cringy to the max. I felt my face flush with embarrassment. I mean, we were in a place full of people I didn't even know, and here he was, acting like it was a concert. I kept hoping it would end soon, but Dylan was in full-blown rapper mode. It wasn't just a few lines. It was a full-on freestyle session. He even started including random details about our relationship in his lyrics, and it was honestly a little disturbing. Like things only he would know. He rapped about the first time we went on a date, how I loved my favorite ice cream, and how he would never let me go. He rapped realized. Remember that night, the stars shining bright. I said we'd make it, I promised we'd fight. You think you're walking away, but I can't let go. Girl, I'll be the one, just let me show. By now I was mortified. I just wanted to get out of there. The more he rapped, the more I realized there was no reasoning with him. I tried to tell him to stop, calm down, but he just ignored me and kept going. Everyone around us was just watching in stunned silence. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My face was bright red, and I couldn't even make eye contact with anyone. Eventually, the whole place was just so awkward that I had to leave. I grabbed my stuff. I'm pretty sure I ran out of there. I didn't even know what to say to him. I couldn't handle it. I left and went straight home, hoping that would be the last of it. But of course it wasn't. Dylan didn't stop. The next day, my phone started blowing up with texts and calls from random numbers. Some of them were from people I didn't even recognize, and the messages were all the same. Did you see Dylan's post? You need to see this. I didn't even want to check. I knew it couldn't be good, but curiosity got the best of me, so I opened the messages. And there it was. Dylan had posted a video on his Instagram of him rapping. The video was tagged with my name, and the caption was something like, "Don't let go of love, it's not over yet." It was getting thousands of views. People I didn't even know were commenting on it, and some of my friends had shared it too. It was all over social media. I had to delete my Instagram for a while. I didn't want to deal with the drama. But that wasn't even the worst part. No, the worst part came a few days later when I got a message from Dylan's lawyer. He was suing me. The lawyer's email claimed that Dylan had suffered emotional distress from the breakup and that I was to blame for the mental damage he had endured. It said I was responsible for his actions in the coffee shop and how I had abandoned him in front of so many people. It was almost like they were framing the entire breakup as my fault, even though I was the one who had been trying to end things peacefully. And the kicker. Dylan claimed that I owed him for all the public humiliation he went through after his rap performance. He said that because of me, his reputation had been tarnished, and now he was demanding compensation. He was even threatening to take legal action if I didn't settle the case with a payment. Honestly, I didn't even know how to process this. I had just broken up with him because I didn't want to deal with the craziness, and now here he was suing me for what? Not letting him go through some emotional breakdown in peace. I didn't know what to do, so I called a lawyer to help me figure out how to handle this. After a few consultations, they basically told me to stay calm and not engage with Dylan directly. They said it was probably just an attempt to get money from me. It took a while, but eventually the whole thing started to die down. Dylan's lawyer couldn't make a case, and no one really took his emotional distress seriously. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling of dread every time I see a rap video or hear someone mention freestyle. Looking back, I feel like I learned one thing for sure. People can surprise you, but sometimes it's in the worst ways possible, and the whole situation still haunts me. It wasn't just a breakup. It turned into a public spectacle that I couldn't escape. Honestly, I never thought a breakup could go from sad but manageable to straight up nightmare fuel, but here I am telling you about one of the most messed up experiences of my life. I always heard about people having awkward breakups, but no one had ever warned me about what happens when things take a really, really dark turn. So let me take you through it because this is one of those things that'll stick with you. So it all started like any other breakup. I had been dating Shiloh for a little over 6 months. Things were good at first. She was sweet, a little reserved, and honestly pretty chill. But over time, I started noticing things. She would get mad if I didn't text her back right away, or if I hung out with friends instead of spending the weekend with her. The jealousy got worse, and eventually, I started to feel like I was suffocating. I don't know, it just felt like I couldn't breathe anymore. She would get upset over the smallest things, and I didn't want to keep dealing with the constant tension. So I decided to end things. I'd been thinking about it for a while, and I figured it would be better to just do it and move on. I didn't want any drama, just a clean break. I thought we could be adults about it, you know. A simple, I think we need to take a step back, and that would be it. But, oh man, was I wrong. When I sat down to break the news to her, I didn't expect her to cry or anything, but I thought it'd be a little sad, maybe even a bit awkward. That's not what happened, though. As soon as I told her, her face changed. I could see her eyes go from sad to something darker. I don't know what it was, but something in me went on high alert. She didn't say anything at first, just sat there staring at me for what felt like an eternity. Then she slowly stood up. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. I had been thinking about how I was going to explain things to her calmly, how we'd move on. Instead, she walked over to me and, for some reason, started looking at my shoes. Yeah, my shoes. Out of nowhere, she just started staring at them, almost like she was in some kind of trance. It was really weird, and I just stood there, trying to figure out what the heck was going on. I mean, it's just shoes, right? Like, who gets upset about shoes when they're going through a breakup? But then she started mumbling to herself, looking at the soles, then the sides, and then back at the front. Her eyes were wide and unfocused. It was like she wasn't even seeing me anymore. At this point, I was starting to get uncomfortable. The situation was already strange, but now I had no clue what to do. I thought maybe she was just processing the breakup in her own way, but I was wrong. Then she did something that made me question every life choice that led up to that moment. She just dropped down to the ground. Yeah, you heard me. She squatted right there in the middle of my living room like it was the most normal thing in the world. And in that instant, I realized what she was about to do. I still can't wrap my head around it, but there she was dropping a deuce, right there, on the floor, in front of me. I just stood there, frozen in shock, not knowing whether to scream, cry, or just run out the door. I honestly didn't even know what to do. It was like I was watching a nightmare unfold in real time. But it didn't stop there. She finished, and to my horror, she actually picked it up. Yeah, she picked up the poop. She held it in her hand like it was some kind of, I don't know, twisted trophy. And that's when my brain finally caught up with the situation. I started backing away slowly, thinking maybe if I just walked out, I'd never have to speak to her again. But I was wrong. She wasn't done yet. She stood up with the poop still in her hand, and in one smooth motion, she chucked it right at me. At this point, I was no longer frozen in disbelief. I was panicking, my heart was pounding in my chest. I jumped back, barely avoiding the projectile, and that's when I finally snapped into action. I ran out of the apartment as fast as I could, not even bothering to grab my jacket. I was racing, thinking that I had to get as far away from her as possible, and that I never, ever wanted to see her again. I stayed away from the apartment for the rest of the night. I couldn't stop shaking. I wasn't even sure what to tell my friends when they asked me what happened. I just kept replaying the moment in my head over and over. The next day, I found out from a mutual friend that she had posted something on social media. I didn't check it right away, but word spread. Apparently, she had made some cryptic post about purging toxic energy and getting rid of the past with a picture of the mess she had left in my living room. People were commenting, tagging me, making jokes, calling it a power move. It was like everyone in my social circle thought it was some kind of joke or a weird performance art piece. But for me, it wasn't funny. It wasn't anything close to funny. It was messed up. And honestly, I had no idea what had just happened or how to process it. I didn't talk to her again after that, not even once. I blocked her on social media and changed my number just to make sure there was no way for her to contact me. I told my friends about what happened, and most of them couldn't believe it either. To this day, I don't know what the hell went through her mind, but that breakup will haunt me forever. The whole thing was so absurd, so out of left field that I'm still not sure if it was real or some twisted nightmare. But I can tell you this, if you ever think you're ready for a breakup, make sure the other person isn't a few steps away from full-blown chaos. Because I never thought I'd be dodging poop in the middle of a breakup. I'm still trying to wrap my head around what happened. I mean, breakups are tough for everyone, right? But Tristan, he took it to a whole new level. I wish I could say this was some weird movie plot, but no, it's real. It happened to me, and I'm still scared by it. So, here's how it went down. I had been dating Tristan for about 8 months. Honestly, at first, everything seemed perfect. He was charming, funny, and always seemed to know what I needed. I loved the attention he gave me. I mean, who doesn't like to feel special, right? But slowly, over time, I started noticing weird things. He'd make little comments that made me question my reality. Things like, you never remember our plans, or you always overreact. It was small at first, just enough to make me doubt myself. I ignored it for the most part. Everyone has their flaws, right? But then, when things started getting bad, I realized I was actually losing myself. I knew I needed to break up with him. Things weren't right. I felt like I was losing control over my own life, and Tristan's behavior wasn't helping. He was becoming more demanding, more controlling. Whenever I wanted to go out with my friends or do something on my own, he'd make it seem like I was neglecting him. It felt like I was walking on eggshells all the time, trying to keep the peace. But I couldn't do it anymore. I was done. I had to get out. So one night, I decided it was time. We were sitting on the couch watching TV, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know how he'd react, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I told him I was ready to break up, that I just couldn't continue the relationship. He didn't respond the way I thought he would. I expected tears, maybe some anger, but instead, he just smiled. And then he started talking. It was like he was trying to convince me that everything was fine, that I was making a mistake, that I was just being dramatic. I wasn't having it. I stood my ground, and the more I pushed, the weirder it got. That's when he dropped the bomb. He told me I couldn't break up with him. Not legally. Apparently, I had signed some unspoken contract when we first got together. He said that according to the way we'd been living, we were legally bound, like we were married or something. I didn't know what he was talking about. I tried to explain that a breakup doesn't require any legal paperwork, but he wasn't having it. He kept insisting that we had a mutual agreement, and if I tried to leave, he'd sue me. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It sounded so insane, but at the same time, the look in his eyes. He was dead serious. I tried to reason with him, but he just kept repeating that I couldn't break up with him without consequences. He said he'd take me to court. At that point, I didn't even know what to say. I felt like I was in some weird, twisted alternate universe. I was completely lost. But he didn't stop there. He started gaslighting me in a way I've never experienced before. He twisted every word I said, turning everything around until I wasn't sure what was real anymore. He'd tell me things like, "You're being irrational," or "You're making everything up, and you know you don't want to leave me deep down." He'd go on, slowly chipping away at my confidence. I felt like I was stuck in this mind game with no way out. The more he talked, the more confused I became. He started bringing up old conversations and twisting them to his advantage. He'd say things like, "Remember when you said you'd never leave me?" Or that you love me more than anything. He'd replay every argument in his mind, shifting the blame onto me for everything. It felt like nothing I did was ever good enough for him. I started questioning if I was crazy. Was I making the right choice? Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just overreacting. The more I tried to leave, the more he dug in, refusing to accept that I was serious. He'd remind me how much we had been through together, how important our relationship was, and how I couldn't just throw it all away. But no matter how much he said it, I knew deep down that it wasn't right. His actions, his words, it was all manipulation. I tried to talk to a few friends about it, but every time I mentioned what was happening, Tristan would find a way to turn the situation around. He'd act like the victim, saying things like, "I don't know why she's doing this. She's just upset she'll come around," and it worked. My friends started getting confused too. Was I being unreasonable? Was this really that bad? I couldn't even tell anymore. Finally, I reached out to a therapist, hoping to get some clarity on what was happening. She helped me see that this wasn't just a bad breakup. It was emotional manipulation. Tristan was gaslighting me so thoroughly that I couldn't trust my own thoughts. But even with the help of someone else, the fear of what he'd do next was still there. He started showing up at my work, trying to talk to me. He'd leave me notes on my car, sending texts that were borderline threatening, and even emailed my coworkers trying to get me to take him back. It felt like I couldn't escape. Every time I thought it was over, he'd pop up again, doing everything he could to make me feel trapped. At one point, he even told me that if I left, he'd ruin my reputation. He said he'd tell everyone I was crazy, that I was making everything up, and that no one would believe me. And honestly, I started to fear that maybe he could. He had a way of twisting things, of making people believe his version of reality. It was terrifying. I finally got to a point where I realized that I couldn't keep living like this. I had to take control back. I blocked him everywhere, social media, phone, email. I moved to a new apartment and changed my job. It wasn't easy, and I still think about him sometimes, but I finally felt like I was free. I can't explain the toll this whole situation took on me. I spent months second guessing myself, doubting everything I knew. It felt like I was losing my grip on reality. And even now, part of me feels like I'm still healing from it. I never thought a breakup could mess with your mind like that. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that no one should ever have the power to make you feel like you don't have control over your own life. No one should be able to manipulate you into thinking you can't walk away. And no matter how crazy things get, you always have the right to move on.